with the library and do a reading.
A quorum being present, the committee will be in order. The committee is meeting today for consideration of H.R. 1516, the DHS Restrictions on Confucius Institutes and Chinese Entities of Concern Act, H.R. 6174, the DHS Biodetection Improvement Act, H.R. 5969, the Improving Travel for Families Act, H.R. 4403, the Securing the Cities Improvement Act, and H.R. 6231, the Department of Homeland Security Policy and Issuance Review Act. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare the committee in recess at any point. Pursuant to Committee Rule 7C, any request for recorded votes may be postponed. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. To all our members, especially Ranking Member Thompson, thank you for your cooperation leading up to today's markup. I'm encouraged by the work we did to get to this point, and I'm confident at the end of the day, every member of this committee will be proud of the legislation that we advance. This markup reflects our mutual commitment to secure the homeland and improve the Department of Homeland Security. The 5 bills we're discussing today all deserve broad support. First, we will consider H.R. 1516, the DHS Restrictions on Confucius Institutes and Chinese Entities of Concern Act. As the members of this committee know, the Chinese Communist Party uses Confucius Institutes on university campuses to spy on Americans. In May, the FBI confirmed to the Subcommittee on Counterterrorism, Law Enforcement, and Intelligence that the Chinese Communist Party is working to steal academic research at American universities. And as FBI Director Ray stated, Confucius Institutes are platforms for the CCP to disseminate communist propaganda, encourage censorship, and restrict academic freedom on our campuses. H.R. 1516 will ban DHS funds from flowing to American universities that host a Confucius Institute or maintain a relationship with a Chinese entity of concern. It's going to mitigate the risk posed by the Chinese Communist Party to our institutions of higher education. Last week, a Government Accountability Office report showed that some universities reported closing Confucius Institutes mainly in response to the potential loss of federal funding. Universities are starting to realize that the threat that the CCP poses, but now is no time for Congress to let up. Congress has previously acted to prevent DoD funding from going to universities with Confucius Institutes. We must make sure that similar actions are taken by the Department of Homeland Security. I want to thank Congressman Pfluger for his work on this bill and his efforts to expose the threat of this adversarial and dangerous regime. I encourage my colleagues to vote yes on this legislation. Next, we'll consider H.R. 6174, the DHS Biodetection Improvement Act. For some time, there have been questions about the effectiveness of the Department of Homeland Security's BioWatch program. That's why in 2019, DHS launched a new acquisition program to move into the next generation of detection of biothreats and to replace the BioWatch program with new and more reliable technology. However, DHS has not used all the resources at its disposal, including the national laboratories housed within the Department of Energy. H.R. 6174 would ensure DHS is doing everything it can to improve biodetection research and development, including requiring DHS to explain how it plans to use the Department of Energy national labs. Congressman Strong, thank you for your work on this bill, and I hope all the members of the committee see the need for it and support it today. I'm also proud to support H.R. 5969, the Improving Travel for Families Act, which will streamline the customs process for Customs and Border Protection, screening travelers at airports, and for families returning from international travel. This bill will allow children ages 10 and under traveling with a parent or guardian who is a Global Entry member to accompany the parent through Global Entry lane at the airport. It would also allow a parent applying for Global Entry to schedule a single interview for up to 4 children. I know this bill will make things much easier for our CBP officers working at the airports and for American families coming back home. Thank you, Congressman Luttrell, for proposing this bill. Securing the Cities Improvement Act, H.R. 4403. Since 2007, DHS has operated the Securing the Cities initiative to help cities prepare for and respond to nuclear and radiologic threats. Congressman Carter's proposal would remove the requirement for a jurisdiction to be designated as a high-risk urban area by FEMA. His bill would also require DHS to establish performance metrics and milestones for the STC program to track its performance and monitor its expenditures. And I want to thank Congressman Carter for his work on this bill. Finally, we'll consider H.R. 6321, the Department of Homeland Security Policy and Issuance Review Act. DHS should be reviewing its policies and directives every 2 years. Unfortunately, DHS is consistently failing to update its policies in an appropriate time frame. Because this department can't seem to do the work on time, Congress must step in. DHS has 250,000 employees and is still months or even years late in reviewing and updating policies. This has to change. Congressman Ivey's bill will provide better oversight and accountability of DHS by establishing a formal and timely review process of policy decisions, addresses this problem, and requires DHS to give Congress an annual briefing on the status of its policy review process. I want to thank Congressman Ivey for the hard work on that bill. I know it will help the department run much more effectively. I now recognize the ranking member to make an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today, the committee will consider 4 measures that aim to broadly improve the operations of the Department of Homeland Security. Mr. Carter's Securing the Cities Improvement Act would allow the Countering Weapons of Mass Destruction Office, or CWMD, to determine which cities it partners with for the Securing the Cities program, rather than having the partnership tied to a FEMA grant program, the Urban Area Security Initiative. This would allow CWMD to determine its partners based on the capability and capacity of the jurisdiction, rather than the viable UASI designation. This bill would provide stability within the Security the Cities program and partnerships with at-risk cities. Mr. Ivey's Department of Homeland Security's Policy Issuance Review Act is a good government measure meant to enhance congressional review of certain department-level internal policies, many of which provide foundational guidance to offices and employees. The briefing required by the bill would not only improve congressional oversight, but it would also help DHS prevent long gaps in policy review and cancellation. Mr. Luttrell's Improving Travel for Families Act will permit 10 years of age under to accompany their parents on legal guardian through the global entry lane as U.S. international airports if the parents participate in global entry. Customs and Border Protection agrees that global entry should be more family-friendly, and I understand CBP is already working on guidance to implement the intent of the bill. Mr. Strong's DHS Biodetection Improvement Act requires DHS to produce an assessment and strategy regarding how DHS uses the Department of Energy's national laboratories and sites for biodetection capabilities. The Homeland Security Act of 2002 already contemplates DHS partnering with national labs, and this measure would give Congress greater insight into that work with regard to biodetection capabilities. At this point, though, I'd like to note that both Mr. Strong's and Mr. Carter's bill require a fully functional Countering Weapons of Mass Destruction office. That office authority is set to expire next month, and its closure would endanger national security. In May, our committee sought to extend the life of CWMD by 7 years, but despite a unanimous vote by Mr. D'Esposito, bill has not made it to the House floor. I hope the chairman will join me in doing everything possible to make sure this critical office does not close next month. Now, Mr. Chairman, our side of the aisle was looking forward to a bipartisan seamless markup with bills to enhance the security of our nation. However, Republican extremism has found its way into today's proceeding. I'll turn to Mr. Pfluger's DHS restrictions on Confucius Institute and Chinese Entities of Concern Act. There's no question that the People's Republic of China and the Chinese Communist Party have sought to influence U.S. colleges and universities for malign purposes through Confucius Institutes and other programs. I support the intent of this bill, I voted for the thoughtful bipartisan version of the bill that emerged from this committee last Congress. So I was disappointed that Mr. Pfluger chose to ignore last Congress's bill and introduce the unworkable version that is before us today. H.R. 1516 would deny almost all the colleges and universities in each of our districts critical DHS funds, which could jeopardize emergency preparedness and response. As written, the bill also fails to contain waiver language that is currently given to the Secretary of Defense under existing law. Such a waiver would provide strategic flexibility to the Secretary of Homeland Security, and it is absolutely essential for a bill like this. Too often, this Congress, Mr. Chairman, Republicans have chosen to play politics with national security instead of taking yes for an answer. Later, I will offer an amendment containing a text of Mr. Pfluger's bill that we agreed to last Congress. My amendment would offer members the opportunity to oppose Chinese interference in a way that does not burden our colleges and universities and unnecessarily tie DHS's hand. I hope my colleagues will join me in sending one clear bipartisan message to the PRC and CCP by adopting my amendment. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Thompson. Other members of the committee are reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record. Without objection and by agreement between the chair and ranking member, the committee shall use an amendment roster today.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, you're recognized.
reserving the right to object, I will not object. Would the chair please explain the agreement regarding the amendment roster? I yield to the chairman.
I thank the gentleman and all committee members for agreeing to the use of an amendment roster. We have agreed that the bills be open to amendment at any point and that we will take up amendments in order listed on the roster. The chair will also allow members to offer amendments listed on the roster out of order to the extent practicable and in a manner not prohibited by House or committee rules. Amendments not listed on the roster may be considered at the conclusion of consideration of the roster.
I thank the chair for this explanation and withdraw my reservation.
Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 1516, DHS Restrictions on Confucius Institutes and Chinese Entities of Concern Act. The bill was circulated in advance and printed copies are available. The clerk shall designate the bill.
H.R. 1516.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and it is considered read and open to amendment at any point. I now recognize Mr. Pfluger for the purpose of offering an amendment in the nature of a substitute. The clerk will report the amendment in the nature of the substitute.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 1516 offered by Mr. Pfluger.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with, and the amendment is in the nature of a substitute, shall be considered base text for the purpose of further amendments. The gentleman from Texas is now recognized for 5 minutes on his amendment.
Thank you, Chairman Green. This critical piece of common sense legislation before the committee day deserves our attention. It deserved our attention in the 117th Congress. For years, the Chinese Communist Party, working through the People's Liberation Army, has executed sophisticated propaganda and espionage campaigns across the globe. Of particular concern is the CCP's practice of exploiting the open and collaborative nature of American academia to conduct widespread industrial and military espionage inside the United States. Confucius Institutes were first formed in 2004. These initiatives were marketed by the CCP as a way to promote Chinese language and culture, support local Chinese teaching internationally, and facilitate cultural exchanges. However, it quickly became apparent that Confucius Institutes were an extension of the CCP's global influence apparatus, allowing it to impact the decisions of academic institutions, spy on the activities of the homeland, and promote military-civil fusion programs. Military-civil fusion is the CCP's aggressive national strategy to help the PRC develop the most technologically advanced military in the world by the year 2049, often through the theft of American intellectual property and trade secrets. The United States government has rightly taken some successful action against this encroachment in the last several years. In 2021, the NDAA prohibited DoD funding from going to institutions of higher education that host Confucius Institutes, very similar to the base text of this bill that I'm proposing. But now the time occurs for us and the Department of Homeland Security to take similar action. Under no circumstances should a school in the United States be allowed to receive DHS funding while tacitly accepting CCP's money that comes with the price tag of fealty. This legislation I put forward today, H.R. 1516, the DHS Restrictions on Confucius Institutes Act, ensures that school prioritize the security of their scientific research and with technological development efforts above a paycheck from the CCP or entities affiliated with the CCP or the People's Liberation Army. Specifically, this legislation restricts DHS funding from going to universities who maintain relationships with entities connected to the CCP to support China's military civil fusion programs. This bill ensures taxpayer dollars are appropriately used and encourages universities to end relationships with partners who do not have America's best interest in mind. More importantly, this bill ensures U.S. institutions are free of foreign influence and safe from the theft of their research and development work. Now, it was said earlier that this is extreme. Unfortunately, we have to draw a line in the sand. This should have happened last year. In fact, some on this committee may say it's not the same bill that passed out of the committee last Congress. That is true. This bill is actually stronger and actually draws that line in the sand. The threat landscape has shifted, and in addition, I worked in good faith last Congress with this committee in the previous majority under the assurance that this bill would receive floor consideration. It did not. Again, I worked in good faith with this committee, with the prior chairman, to do that. Instead, a compromised legislative bill was offered as an NDAA amendment, but it was blocked by the Rules Committee. You're going to hear arguments that this bill adversely impacts HBCUs, MSIs, and HSIs from receiving critical funding. I don't agree with this perspective. This bill simply asks universities to make a choice. Continue to take money from entities connected to the CCP or sever those ties and be eligible for all DHS taxpayer funding. Many HBCUs, MSIs, and HSIs have already voluntarily chosen to sever those ties. Specifically, in my home state of Texas and other states like Alabama, they have chosen to discontinue ties with entities associated with the CCP for the purpose of providing security here in the homeland. Look, it's time that we draw a line in the sand. Either you support national security or you don't. This is a very simple bill, and I, for the life of me, could not understand why anybody would vote against this particular legislation. If you're a university and you want to take money from the CCP, you don't get the access to national security-related research dollars that DHS or DOD offers. DOD has already made that clear. They've already drawn the line in the sand. So for us, in the committee that was formed after the tragic events of 9/11, to sit here and say that this is partisan is absolutely ludicrous. According to President Biden's national security strategy, the People's Republic of China harbors the intention and increasingly the capacity to reshape the international order in favor of one that tilts the global playing field to its benefit, even as the United States remains committed to managing the competition between our countries responsibly. And I quote, that's his national defense strategy. I'd like to thank my staffer, Chase Savage, for following this for the last 3 years. It's time that we do come together, and I agree with the ranking member. Let's have a bipartisan approach. This is an easy bill to support, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields. Does anyone wish to speak on the amendment?
Mr. Chairman.
You're recognized.
Okay. I would ask my colleague a couple of questions about this. One is, I looked at the list of schools that are still have these institutes. Most of them I didn't recognize. Stanford kind of jumped off the page at me, though. And I was curious as to whether you or your staff or the committee staff had touched base with Stanford, which would seem to be kind of at the heart of the issue with respect, because it's in Silicon Valley, it's got the type of R&D research programs that are going on, but they've opted to continue going forward with this effort. Did you get any feedback from Stanford University about the impact of this legislation or the need for this legislation?
The gentleman yields.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, thank you. And I think my colleague, we've gotten feedback from a lot of universities. And specifically to the question of Stanford, I need to check, but a lot of universities have made the decision since I offered this legislation about 2 years ago to sever those ties and to move away from it. And those that have it, and in the case of Stanford, if they are one, and we have gotten feedback from academia writ large that this policy is very much in line with what the DoD is already doing with their grant program, and really falls under the auspice of national security protection. A lot of universities are doing good work. Stanford is one of those. But the prevention of research to a scientific conclusion is very much a concern, in addition to the theft of intellectual property or worse that we've seen in some of these cases. So yes, we have gotten quite a bit of feedback, positive feedback from universities. I'll check on Stanford in particular. I yield.
I'd appreciate that. And just as a follow-up, the University of Maryland's in my district, and they were one of the first institutions to become participants with the Confucius Institute. They also dropped it recently, I think because of this type of legislation that's gone through. They did not express concerns about infiltration from, communist China or anything. Really, it was just a concern about not wanting to lose funding. They didn't want the penalty of the loss of funding for research. And I do note, too, here that the GAO report that's dated October 2023 references that the FBI, I'll just read it, stated that the agency has not found enough evidence of criminal activity or malign influence associated with Confucius Institutes to prioritize them as a national security concern. And in addition to that, I would raise, or sort of ask about this point, if I'm reading the right version of your amendment, I think there had been a waiver language in the ranking member's previous legislation. At least the version of your bill, I don't see that here. Is there, am I reading the right version? Is there no waiver language in your bill, or?
Gentleman is recognized
Yield back.
to answer the question.
No, there is no waiver language, and that really was the issue with the 117th Congress's version, which was not brought to the floor, by the way. So we could have made strides there last year, or we didn't. And I draw your attention to the National Association of Scholars' viewpoint on this, a collective network of academia and professionals throughout the United States who do have a concern about this. There's already precedent for this. This is not new. It just continues to bolster what DoD in their research programs have already done that applies to academia. And the last thing I'll say on this particular subject is a lot of times, and one of the reasons that waivers are very dangerous is because CIs will change their name. They will, like an LLC, be able to move into a new organization. DoD has had a heck of a time tracking those. They've done a very good job of tracking them. But one of the reasons that the waivers are not a good idea is because they do change their names, the entities do shift, and that money is still available with the strings attached that can compromise our national security. Yield back.
Thank you. Just a couple more questions. Oh, I'm running out of time. I would note quickly then that DoD.
If you want to ask a colleague to request some time and yield to you, I'm more than willing to support that or suggest it even.
Happy to do that.
Gentleman yields.
Thank you, Mr.
You have
Goldman.
5
Thank you,
minutes.
Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. Just with respect to the waiver, I think, if I'm reading this right, the DoD language does have a waiver that apparently hasn't been abused because, if I'm reading this right, none have been sought, but at least they have the option to do so. And I guess I would raise the issue with respect to your language because, well, you got an absolute ban on funding is number one. So the risk or the exposure an institution would face if they misunderstand or make the wrong assessment about whether this would be applicable or not could be pretty severe depending on where their funding comes from with respect to Homeland Security. And I did have some questions about sort of the scope of, you've got the definitions for Chinese entity of concern. One of these, I think it's E, provides support to any security. If they do any of these things, they could be considered one of these entities. E is provide support to any security, defense, police, or intelligence organization of the government of the People's Republic of China or the Chinese Communist Party. So, I was just thinking about it. So for police, for example, if you have an entity that provides translators, like an academic institution, and that whole institution would then become defined as an entity under your Section 2, then if that entity provided anything to Stanford, for example, like a translator or a professor or an exchange student or vice versa, if I'm reading this correctly, in absence of a waiver provision, they could lose all of their funding with respect to the Department of Homeland Security. Am I reading that correctly?
Does the gentleman?
Gentleman's recognized.
I yield, I'm sorry.
The definition is the same as it was in the text of the bill last year. So the definition of a Chinese entity of concern, Confucius Institute, has not changed. And that's a key provision.
Just on that point, if I could reclaim my time, I'll yield back in a second. But that's the point of the waiver, though, right? So in the previous bill, you had the waiver provision so that if there was a scenario where that was a broader application, then might make sense in the specific terms of whatever that institution is, then someone could waive the applicability of this. But in your version, there's no safety valve like that. And I yield back.
Actually, my apologies to Mr. Goldman. It's his time, so you
Oh, I'm
yield.
sorry.
And we recognize Mr. Pfluger, I assume. Yeah, of course.
Yeah, and again, to go back kind of to the simplicity of this bill, it really is a choice for each university. And they're going to have to weigh those risks and rewards with their own funding mechanisms. And if they believe that they so desperately need the CCP funding, then that's their choice. And I think that's something that each institution, in the case of University of Maryland, that they have pulled back, and many others have done that, actually quite a few. So I think the safety outlet is the fact that there is no waiver, that you're going to make a choice, and it's either you're in favor of protecting what could be classified information, what could be used in the formation of national security, either tactics, techniques, procedures, research that leads to the security of this country, or you're not. And I think one thing that is different this year, Mr. Ivey, is the threat landscape has completely changed and morphed into what we anticipated it was going to be, but it's here. We have a hot war occurring in Europe. We have an outbreak of war in the Middle East. I know this committee has done many classified briefings on the threat that Confucius Institutes pose to our society. We've done hearings and had witnesses that have told us about CCP-sponsored police stations in major cities like New York City. We have to be eyes wide open, and that's why the approach here is we're going to draw a line in the sand. We're not banning that funding. We're just simply saying that universities need to make a choice, and that choice will be up to them. And if they need DHS funding, then they're going to have to make the choice to not have CCP-sponsored money. I yield to you.
I yield back to Mr. Goldman, and thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Pfluger.
I yield the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields. Does anyone else wish to make? Mr. Carrera, you're recognized.
No. Well, go ahead, Mr. Carr.
Oh,
Go ahead. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Pfluger, I just wanted to try to figure out where we're going with this. Thank you for your good efforts. So you're essentially saying if you receive funding from a Chinese entity of any sort, form, or manner, you're not, no?
Would the gentleman yield?
Of course.
No, that's not true. It's a Chinese entity of concern, as defined, that has a link or an affiliation or association with a CCP-related academia or sponsored institution that has been deemed as a Chinese entity of concern. So there are many other cultural types of organizations that do sponsor, with the monetarily sponsored programs. But this is different, and this is what the DoD has really set the precedent on, is that they have identified these entities, and they do morph, and the names do change.
And that's what I'm trying to figure out here, because you're absolutely right. A lot of these entities in China do morph, and most of the entities in China are owned by the government, if not all. And so the ability to morph is unbelievable. And so I'm trying to figure out here, if you're really trying to stop the funding, or I should say university accessing department or government funding, any entity, I would say any entity, maybe the ones you've identified now, but since they are gonna morph, they have a possibility of a very vague area there where if you're gonna, err on the side of caution, then you're gonna be essentially saying no funding from these entities from China. And, that's maybe a public policy presumption that I'm making, that you're making, but, it doesn't stop China from actually accessing a lot of our research at our universities, because if you essentially decide not to take U.S. government funding, you're still going to be doing relationship building, working with these entities nonetheless, and that could present a threat to our national security?
Yeah, I think
I'm trying to figure this out here.
I think you're making my point. Does the gentleman yield?
Yes.
I think you're making my point. It is very difficult to figure this out. DoD has spent many years trying to figure this out since 2004. This is a good place to start. We know it's not an all-inclusive list. We know that the ability for these entities to shift and move and maneuver and rename, and that exists, but let's start here. This is the strongest signal that we can send to the Chinese Communist Party, who has, on the commercial side, year after year after year, stolen billions of dollars of intellectual property from American companies and from American universities, and we need to say no more, and you're not going to infiltrate these universities, even if, yeah, please go ahead.
Gentleman yield. It's a good start, but I think we're off target, because what you really want is to prevent the transfer, dissemination, stealing, borrowing of our intellectual property by other, in this case, the Chinese Communist Party. And I think we need a different kind of a mechanism to stop this. The funding, all you have to do is say, I'm not going to accept department funding, and they'll continue to work with whoever it is they want to work with internationally.
Will the gentleman yield?
Of course.
Yeah, I mean, this was the conversation we had last Congress. I was very disappointed we didn't bring this to the floor. In the case of what Mr. Ivey is asking for, the waivers, I mean, it was included in last year's. Why didn't we bring that to the floor, and why didn't we have a start for this? Because we all know that the threat is out there, the mechanism, and would be happy to entertain other ideas. But so far, since the 117th Congress, we haven't had those ideas. This wasn't brought to the floor, and this is why we're doing it now, because enough is enough. I yield back.
Mr. Fluger, I just want to say that I think our focus just on the Chinese Communist Party, I think it's probably not enough. I think there are other entities out there that could probably look at that are also in the same business, allies or not, of taking our intellectual property.
If you'll yield for a minute.
Yields his 18 seconds.
I agree with you. I want to work with you on that. This is a good starting point, and again, I really do think this has bipartisan written all over it, that we send a strong message to the CCP. I yield back.
And in the last 5 seconds, I do look forward to working with you on this issue. Thank you.
The gentleman yields. I've got Mr. Bishop and then Mr. Magaziner. So if you'll just kind of get my attention. Mr. Crane, okay. But before I go to Mr. Bishop, I'd like to enter into the record a roster of all of the Department of Education's records since June 22nd of 2021 to 4/6/23. The dollars given to every university in the country, it's a total of from China, $3,099,561,649. If there's no objections, so ordered. And you're welcome to look your university up. We'll pass it around if you'd like. And now recognize Mr. Bishop for 5 minutes.
I thank the chairman, and I've listened with interest to the conversation. And I've looked at the amendment in the nature of a substitute as I'm listening to the conversation. And I'm trying to net this out. I'm curious, and maybe I'd offer to yield to someone who could articulate it. Assuming that the party offering the support, the entity offering the support from China, is indeed an affiliate of the Chinese Communist Party, the government in China, what reason would there be for an exception to the policy of not sending DHS money to to an institution cooperating with that or receiving that? Maybe, Mr. Ivey, if you're leaning forward, could I yield to you for, why would there need to be an exception to that?
Gentleman yields.
I thank my friend. Just off the top of my head and in conversations with the University of Maryland, because you may be getting funds for things that are totally unrelated to anything that could be used for stealing intellectual property or some of those sorts of R&D efforts. So
Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, so like a Chinese language. So as I understood it, the Confucius Institutes were set up to help people learn how to speak Chinese, help Americans learn how to speak Chinese. And part of that's an exchange effort. They teach it here. People go overseas to China and vice versa. Now, there's a possibility that somebody teaching in that program might be in, some kind of Fem Nikita kind of role or something, but based on what I saw from the GAO report.
I get it. I think, look, because I just,
I'm sorry.
to preserve as much time as I
Reclaim your
can.
time.
I'm sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Use the rest. So it seems to me, so let's, all right, take that assumption. Chinese communist government wants to send people over or provide funding to the University of Maryland to teach Chinese. Well, I think that maybe gets at it. The problem with, all sorts of espionage in general involves setting up links with someone who wants to have an influence operation and wants to develop and inculcate an influence opportunity, and then they want to broaden out from what seems to be innocuous to things that don't seem to be innocuous, that we've seen over and over by the Chinese Communist Party in the United States. The most notorious one of these police stations they have to sort of monitor and control Chinese people or people of Chinese extraction who are in the United States. I don't see a reason to be concerned about stopping DHS money from supporting an institution that is permitting that to happen. I don't see a reason for a Chinese Communist Party facilitated and funded outfit to ever be allowed to establish a foothold in the United States. There's no reason that someone in the Chinese population or some entity from China not affiliated with the government to have that opportunity.
Gentleman yields.
And so, well, let me just make this point, Lou. It seems, so I was looking at the legislation to figure out, well, what if there's some problem? Well, if you look through the definition of the Chinese entity of concern, it's pretty tight. It's about things that are affiliated with the Chinese Communist government or supports their defense or whatever. And here's the key point. Look at the last subsection of the document. The way this works is the Secretary of Homeland Security is supposed to ensure that this being performed by saying to the college or university concerned, if they identify such an entity, now that means DHS is going to have to know what this entity is, that there's funding coming through, that it falls under the definition of an entity of concern, and then the DHS says to that institution, we're going to have to cut off your funding unless you cease this affiliation. So it's not like this is an inadvertence or that they're going to proceed without any basis. In fact, Mr. Ivey would know that as a matter of administrative procedure, they can't proceed in an arbitrary or capricious manner. They're going to have a basis and evidence to conclude that there's such a violation, and then they warn, and only if the warning is refused or ignored could there be a deprivation of funding. I don't see the risk, a material risk. And in fact, if you can understand, I don't think DHS is going to apply effort to that unless there's some good reason to do it. I don't see a reason to build in. I think the problem is we do a lot of wanting to seem to address something. The motto of my state is esse quam videris, to be rather than to seem. A lot of times people want to move something like this so gives us a cosmetically, we're dealing with this threat when people don't really want it dealt with after all. And they want to be able to propose some sort of backdoor in the administration so they can just waive this whenever they want to. I don't see a reason to do that, and I'm looking to hear, honestly, in the course of this conversation, why that reason exists. I yield.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Magaziner for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman, and I want to thank Congressman Pfluger for introducing the bill. Let me just start by saying intellectual property theft by the CCP is a real problem. Espionage by the CCP is a real problem. It's frankly been eye-opening to me since I got here to Congress as I've learned the extent to which the CCP is determined to steal intellectual property from U.S. companies, to spy on U.S. critical infrastructure. I had a general sense that countries spy on each other all the time, but what the CCP is doing in the United States is above and beyond international norms. And that is why it is important that we take measures to protect U.S. companies, U.S. research, U.S. military capability from the CCP as they seek to undermine our military advantage, undermine U.S. companies' competitiveness, and steal jobs, which is another aspect of this as well, right? Because a lot of the IP theft is to help Chinese companies produce knockoff products. That means fewer jobs and less manufacturing here in the United States. All of that being said, I do have some questions here because as I understand it, this bill is quite a bit different from the version that passed the committee in the 117th. That version, as I understood it, had the same definition for a Chinese entity of concern, but was not an automatic restriction on funding for entities of concern. There was a reporting requirement, and there was also the ability for DHS to offer waivers. As I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong, the version that passed last year had a DHS funding ban specifically for Confucius institutes, but not necessarily for entities of concern, which is a broader category. Is that correct?
If you'll yield.
Gentleman's recognized.
Yeah, and again, this is really fundamental to the argument, is that at the point in time where I offered this bill with no waiver ability last year, we couldn't even get it to the floor. And so the threat landscape having changed, I think one of the most important things right now is that we look at the intent, as you mentioned, and they do have the intent to steal, to surveil, to conduct espionage. And when you look at what a GAO report that talks about a number of schools, in 2019, the number of CIs has dropped, from 100 to 5. In 74 of those instances, the removal of DoD funding through the NDAA bill was cited as a reason.
And I'm sorry, I got to reclaim just because I just want to understand the facts. So the definition of an entity of concern is fairly broad. It includes, for example, the Chinese State Administration for Science, Technology, and Industry for the National Defense. So any Chinese university that had a relationship with that state agency, the university would be an entity of concern. As I was looking at, all right, what is the Chinese State Administration for Science, Technology, and Industry? It's primarily a defense-oriented agency, but it also covers their version of NASA, essentially, the National Space Administration for China. And so, for example, I know the United States has entered into an agreement with China and a number of other nations around sharing non-military research related to space. Would a university that was doing that type of research in China and a university that was doing space-related research in the U.S. not be able to receive funding under this bill, even if there's no military application necessarily, and even if we already have an agreement between our two nations to allow that kind of collaboration to occur?
Yeah, again, if you'll yield for a second, the question is on, and we had no disagreement on the definition of entity of concern last Congress. So what has changed this Congress? So if that same entity of concern,
Yeah, well,
the
the difference is that in the bill last year, entities of concern were not automatically barred from all funding, right? Confucius institutes were, entities of concern were not. And so I think the fundamental question for me, and I know I'm low on time, is the definition of entities of concern so broad that we may accidentally be including things that we don't mean to include? And I want to get to the bottom of this and try to have my concerns satisfied, so if someone else will yield, I'd be interested in continuing the conversation.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. McCall for 5 minutes.
It's an interesting debate. I chaired this committee, and this came to my attention when I chaired this committee. Confucius Institutes being a soft power used by China, directed out of the United Front Work Department in the Chinese Communist Party, and inside the Ministry of Education. They talk about their Minister of Propaganda in 2010. So trying to put a time frame on all this stuff in terms of the reaction time of this committee to what has happened from a timeline in China. 2010, the Chinese Minister of Propaganda declared we should actively carry out international propaganda battles against issuers such as, they talk about Tibet, Taiwan, Falun Gong. We should do well in establishing and operating overseas cultural centers and Confucius institutes. And they talk about it being a soft power. And then this is back, again, this is going, the timing of this bill and what I think my colleague from Texas is trying to do, the urgency. We've waited a while. The FBI director testified, back then that he had concerns about it. Director Ray said they're exploiting the very open research and development that we have, which we all revere, but they're taking advantage of it. This letter I wrote, just to put it in context, was in 2018. It was 5 years ago. I wrote this letter to the Texas universities in my state, and guess what? The next day I got a call from all of them saying that they were going to stop and close down the Confucius Institutes in Texas because of the threat, because of what the FBI was telling us at that time and told the universities at that time. So I don't know, I guess I'm missing, there may be some salient points here that I may have missed.
Would the gentleman yield?
But I just think that, the time is kind of now to get this done. I'd be happy to, yeah.
I'm looking at thank you. I'm looking at the GAO report, which basically says that, most schools did not express concerns about potential security or other risks related to Confucius institutes. That's page 15 of the report. Schools generally reported losing resources provided by Confucius institutes due to the change. The schools took steps to drop the Confucius institutes, not because they were worried about any kind of theft of IP or R&D, but just they were worried about losing the funding. So, the only point I think that we're trying to make is
You can reclaim your
I am.
I'm sorry, just 5 more
No, go
seconds.
ahead,
I think the intent's great,
Yeah.
but there's a disconnect between the theft issue, that's based on what the FBI and the GAO
So
are saying.
I will reclaim my time
Yes,
now.
sir.
I kind of know this stuff, but it's soft power. It's not the hard power. It's not the espionage piece is the 1,000 Talents program that they have. And that is more insidious. That they were able to infiltrate NASA, for instance. I know Mr. Magazine was talking about space. A Texas A&M professor got indicted for espionage because he was working with NASA and giving information to China. Now that's a criminal case. What Confucius really is their soft power arm within the universities to exercise their propaganda, with the students to, influence them. That say, for instance, the Tibetans those monks are really bad people, or Taiwan is part of China and should be rightfully reunified, and how dare Taiwan, even under the Taiwan Relations Act of 1979, they have no right to do what they're doing. That's the sort of thing I'm talking about. This would be more a classroom soft power propaganda coming out of the Chinese Minister of Education itself, which was stated in this letter, directly into our schools. That was a problem we had. You're correct. The Thousand Talents program, that's the one that really worries me. And the China initiative that, I sat down with Merrick Garland. I was a DOJ attorney. I sat down with him last year in his office, just the two of us. Why did you shut down the China initiative? That was the initiative going after these espionage cases. Just in 1 second here, the Houston consulate in my state got shut down because of the amount of espionage cases coming out of there. That was unprecedented. And the idea that we don't have espionage cases, I don't know why that initiative was shut down as well, because there clearly has been a lot of espionage coming out of that building, and all the employees went back to China. They were hitting the Texas Medical Center, NASA, the energy sector. And so that's just my point of view.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize the ranking member for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. I will offer an A&S after the debate, but I don't think there's any questions about the Confucius Institute or the Chinese Communist Party. They both are bad. I think part of the challenge for us is, as we deal with the other aspects of doing away with everything, I think by saying no DHS funds will go to universities, there are some ongoing programs right now that our universities do in China that would be harmed. And I'm convinced that this legislation, in its current form, has some serious unintended consequences that some of my colleagues are trying to outline. But when you just draw the line saying no, I just think that is a bit too far. I yield to the gentleman from California, Mr. Correa.
Gentleman yields.
Thank you very much. I just, Mr. Pfluger, trying to work with you on this and trying to figure it out. Our counterintelligence needs to know what's going on in China. We've got to have some relationships. And coming out of the state of California, one of our biggest industries is the pharmaceutical industry. Got a lot of research and development, and a lot of that research and development university also kind of seeps over into China. A lot of research there as well. We need to know what they're doing and work with them. Whether we want or not, we had COVID-19 and originated in China. We had to work with them to figure out the solution to this challenge. And so we have to fund university research, university ties with entities that we may not find palatable. So I'm just, help me out. I'm trying to work with how do we reconcile those kinds of scenarios with your legislation, sir?
If you'll yield.
Of course.
Of course the schools claim that there's no threat, but every single one of us is invited down to the skiff to participate in the briefs.
And I'm not saying that there's not a...
Whether we show up or not,
I'm not saying there's not a threat. I'm just saying there's certain
in the process of deeming...
Gentleman reclaims. Do you yield or?
Just very quickly, I'm not saying there's not any threats. I'm just trying to figure out how to wordsmith, how to, essentially work with your legislation to make it operative on these other circumstances. And go ahead, Mr.
Thank you.
Gentleman yields.
The fact is that when DHS works with the university to deem an entity of concern, I think they mean it. I think they actually say, we are concerned about this entity. And so I really don't see a reason to have a waiver when DHS says, we're concerned that this entity using military, that's one thing that you guys have not brought up. The definitions here all talk about civil military fusion, military research, military applications. So that's the risk to national security that I think we're missing here. And Lou, the point of this is that we have access to briefs beyond what GAO is providing or beyond what the universities are talking about. And that's why this bill is written in the way it is, because it is a concern. I don't think there's a reason for a waiver. Unfortunately, we didn't get this done on the 117th. And so now is the time. I'll yield back.
I yield, Mr. Magaziner.
Gentleman yields to Mr. Magaziner. Well, actually, the time belongs to the ranking member.
Yes.
So listen,
Yields the balance of his time to Mr. Magaziner.
the definitions here are broader than, the definitions here, the applications here are broader than in the previous version, right? Because in the previous version, not all entities of concern were automatically denied funding without a waiver. So what we're trying to figure out is this version too broad? And as I understand it, this is not necessarily just limited to research related to military applications, right? The way the bill spells this out, if any university or college in China has any relationship with, the military complex in China, then U.S. universities would not be able to work with those universities, no matter what they're working on. So universities in the United States have departments that do lots of different things. You could have a university in the United States with an engineering department that's working with DoD, and with other departments that are doing totally unrelated things. And I imagine the same is true in China, right? And so what we're saying under this version is that universities could not work with each other on totally unrelated things with no military application if they also have departments that work in the military space. Is that correct?
Let me way. And the next person to be recognized, I think, is Mr. Higgins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, this should not be a heavy lift, this bill. At some point, would it be okay if the Homeland Security Committee of the People's House focused on the Homeland Security of the people we serve? The strategy of the Chinese Communist Party is to subvert American culture and to weaken American economic stability. Our universities receive billions of dollars of American treasure in funding. The CCP infiltrates the university systems across the country, scientific and engineering laboratories. They steal the intellectual property of engineering and scientific advances that are born in those laboratories and deliver it back to China, and this cycle continues. So all this bill does is it identifies Chinese entities of concern. There's a great deal of thought went into this. America should kind of grasp this. This is clearly effective and well-written legislative language that would restrict American treasure from going through the Department of Homeland Security to fund university laboratories that are engaged with Communist Chinese Party known entities of concern. It's not a heavy lift. I think it's the American people recognize that our university systems across the country, they can hire who they want, but they don't have to receive funding from the Department of Homeland Security if they're using that funding to subvert the security of the nation by doing business with in this case, identified as Chinese entities of concern. You're really talking about the Communist Chinese Party and their long-term goals and strategies to subvert American culture and to weaken American economic prosperity. They've very effectively been using our university systems for a long time. This transcends political affiliation. And through Clinton and W and Obama and Trump and now Biden, every administration through Democratic majority and Republican majority, this has been ongoing. We should at least be able to use the power of the purse as a body to restrict funding for universities that have crossed that line and are allowing Chinese communist spies into the laboratories that we're funding. So this is effective legislation, and I yield the balance of my time to my colleague, Mr. Pfluger.
And Chairman, I'll yield back to.
The
gentleman yields.
One sentence to me.
If I may, Mr. Pfluger, I yield to my colleague, Mr.
You
Bishop.
may yield to
Just
Mr.
a quick point of emphasis. And that university in question won't stop when asked by DHS. That's the only time this becomes operative. And by the way, once they stop, they get their money back. It says it right there. I don't appreciate the risk. In fact, it's a little tepid, Mr. Pfluger. I mean, we're still letting the Chinese Communist government come in here with their 1,000 talents under this. All this does is Chinese military connected entities. I don't understand why this is that hard. I yield back to Mr. Higgins.
Reclaiming my time, I yield the balance to Mr. Pfluger.
Thank you, and I think I've said all that needs to be said. I'll yield back to you.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Carter.
Mr. Chairman, I yield my time to Mr. Magaziner.
And I won't be long because I don't want to belabor anything. I agree with Mr. McCall. It is time for us to pass a version of this bill, 100%. The threat is real. Chinese espionage, IP theft are real. American universities, unfortunately, are a conduit for that. No disagreement there. What I am concerned about is how broad this legislation, this version of legislation appears to be for me. So again, the way it's written, if a department of a Chinese university has a relationship with the Chinese version of NASA, right, and a totally unrelated department is working with an American university on something, then they are restricted from this funding. If the University of Rhode Island, right, we've got a great marine biology program at the University of Rhode Island, or the Ocean State, if they were working with a Chinese university on marine science, on fisheries, something that had nothing to do with the military, no military application at all, but that Chinese university had a separate department that was working with the Chinese version of NASA, then as I understand it,
Would the gentleman yield to the chair?
that collaboration would not be permitted because the definition, yes, in a second, the definition of an entity of concern is any Chinese college or university that works with one of these Chinese defense-related agencies in any respect. I'll yield.
The gentleman yields. I want to thank him for that. I just want to point out the Intelligence Act of 2017 from the Chinese Communist Party that requires all data to be shared that is gathered. So any entity, I mean, it is all one entity, right? So,
yeah.
And you're aware of that, okay.
Okay, right, understood. But again, I'm talking about research, Representative Correa used the example of research in the healthcare space. I'm using I'm trying to think of examples that are as far away from the military field, as far away from, profitable US IP as possible. Could not work with a Chinese university if an unrelated department in that university was also doing research that had a military application.
Would you yield one more time to me, though? As I understand it, by the definition, it would only be those with ties to the military.
Right, but again, as in our universities, our large universities, there are some departments that may be doing work with our military, our DOD, and other departments that do, romance languages or things that are totally unrelated. And so I guess what I'm saying is, if this were limited to research that had defense applications or industrial applications, that I would understand. If there was even just a simple waiver, then I would support this bill most likely. If we pass the ranking member's amendment to allow for waivers, I would certainly support this bill. But I am concerned that while the intent is 100% right, and I absolutely agree we ought to pass something in this space as soon as possible, we may be inadvertently doing this more broadly than any of us would intend or any of us would agree is reasonable. I'll yield back to the.
Well,
I don't remember who I have time from at this point. So whoever it is.
The ranking member has 1 minute and 33 seconds.
Well, thank you. The only thing I'd say is we tried to negotiate with Mr. Pfluger, and I heard Mr. Bishop say the bill is soft. We actually tried to make it harder in our negotiations. Let me tell you what we said. We said Chinese entities of concern language be banned S&T R&D funding for any U.S. university that has a relationship with any Chinese university, since basically every Chinese university contributes to the Chinese defense industry in some way. so long as the DHS secretary can issue a case-by-case waiver. So we basically tried to ban everything, but we couldn't get it negotiated. And so that kind of brings us to where we are now. But there were a lot of us who wanted to do exactly what I'm hearing people say that's not in the bill, and we weren't able to get it in. I yield back.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Menendez for 5 minutes. I think he's the last one that's asked to speak.
I'm sure people are excited about that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to go over a couple of points that just for me, I think provide clarity as to some of the challenges with this version of the bill. First, Mr. Bishop mentioned that sometimes we want to seem to actually be doing something as opposed to actually doing something, but in the last Congress, the version that Mr. Thompson will offer as an amendment in the nature of a substitute worked for both parties. So last Congress, it worked as something that was actually doing something, and I think it is the better of the two versions for a couple of reasons. One, we've talked a lot about the definitions. They're mostly the same between the two pieces of legislation. But in this instance, without the waiver, there's a number of potential issues, mainly in footfalls, right? Inadvertent violations, not by the Stanfords, not by the Texas A&Ms, not by the University of Maryland, but in my district, New Jersey City University, a small college that is primarily for first-time college graduates, had a relationship with Confucius Institute, which they terminated. Now, under the definitions, a relationship is any agreement, not like significant funding, not being in your research facilities. It's any agreement, which to me could not even be a monetary arrangement. It could be an exchange of students. We've talked about what happens if there is a relationship. Well, one is people say that they can terminate. Mr. Bishop and many others are attorneys, so not knowing what those agreements are and what the ability to terminate those agreements immediately might mean that they lack the ability to do so and therefore would not be able to receive any funds from the Department of Homeland Security. Even if they are able to terminate the agreement, it says shall be eligible. So that doesn't mean any funding that they get from DHS is automatically reinstated. So it could be a particular grant that they lose funding for. They'd have to reapply. That could take several years. That could have an impact on a lot of different universities, not the Stanfords of the world, but the community colleges, the smaller universities in all of our states and districts. And to me, that's why the issue of a waiver is so important, because we can send a signal to China. We can be strong on this issue, but I don't think we should inadvertently potentially penalize the smaller colleges and universities, which were covered in the prior legislation. That, to me, are the critical differences. Send a strong message, but let's not inadvertently penalize some smaller universities that may not have the resources to monitor this legislation, especially, as Mr. Pfluger has said, this is difficult to figure out which entities we're talking about if it's not the Confucius Institute, because as you said, as LLCs, can change form rather quickly. So can some of these, what are we calling them? Chinese entity of concern. And I think for those reasons, my preference, which was a bipartisan proposal in the last Congress, is the better approach here. We can do both things. It actually is doing something as opposed to just seeming to do something, as I believe you all felt in the last Congress. And with that...
Will the gentleman yield?
Sure thing.
30 seconds.
Yeah.
The gentleman yields.
It's not any relationship. It's any relationship with an entity of concern as defined through the definitions that go through a military application. So it's not any agreement. And in the case of New Jersey City University, if they had a relationship that then applied to those definitions of a civil-military fusion or military strategy or as defined here, then it would be limiting, because the entity of concern was used by DOD as a morphing mechanism to identify that Confucius Institutes were named that, and then they morphed. And these names, these players might have changed, but the strategy and the desire to undermine national security did not. So it is not any relationship. It's a relationship with an entity of concern as named by DHS for good reason. I'll yield back.
I appreciate that. I'll reclaim. And I understand your point in terms of, because there's two parts, right? The entities, that identifying which entities we're talking about with entities of concern, right? And then also the type of relationship, right? And the type of relationship can be any type of relationship with the set university or set list of institutions. And to me, that's where you potentially get into some issues.
If the gentleman will yield.
Sure.
The type of relationship is very important. You've rightly pointed that out. It's a monetary relationship. It's a relationship.
I reclaim on that, because as I'm reading in section 4, relationship, the term relationship means with respect to an institution of higher education, any contract awarded or agreement entered into, as well as any in-kind donation or gift received from a Confucius Institute or Chinese entity of concern. I see potential donation as a monetary component. I don't see with respect to agreement entered that it has to be a monetary funding agreement. And I would yield back if you would like to correct me.
I think the intent of this is monetary. I think that fairly clearly says that any contract awarded or agreement entered into as well as an in-kind gift or donation.
I would take the opposite.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Florida, Mr. Jimenez, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and I won't take 5 minutes. Look, I sit on the select committee on competition between the Communist Chinese Party and the United States, and here's what I've found so far. Nothing that the CCP does is innocuous. It's all nefarious. There are no entities that don't have, they should not be an entity of concern when it concerns China, even a private company or a university, because they're all required to share information with the PLA and the CCP. And so, from my point of view, it's better to be. This is the Committee on Homeland Security, and we oversee the Department of Homeland Security. And nothing to me is more important than the homeland and the security of this homeland. And so if it's going to be a little bit overbroad, so be it. I'd rather be overbroad than be too narrow and make a mistake on it. And so I support this legislation, and I hope that the rest of the committee does, and it truly becomes bipartisan.
Mr. Jimenez, will you yield for 1 second?
I will yield.
I appreciate that, and I get it. I get the approach. My concern is the unintended consequences for universities, colleges in your district, in your state, that if they, by being overbroad and not having a tailored approach with no waiver, right, they could lose any funding from DHS. So in Florida and New Jersey, Hurricane Sandy, Ida, significant consequences where having a FEMA, even just one-off, right, you may not be eligible. And so to be in that situation because we were overbroad with no waiver, again, just unintended consequences. We can do what we did in the last Congress and have a strong approach. To me, this may create some outcomes that we do not intend for, and that's all I'm trying to caution against. I yield back.
And I'll reclaim my time. The answer to that is that I wish them not to have any kind of ties to Confucius Institute. So give up the funding from China. And I understand why they all said, well, hey, we looked at this and we never had a problem, et cetera. What, are they going to tell you they had a problem? They're getting funding from China, for God's sakes. And so they're never going to admit that they had a problem or that they had concerns because of the funding they were getting. How much was it, Mr. Chairman? Over $3 billion?
$3 billion.
In funding they were getting from China, and that's the problem. So what I'd like to see is complete cutoff from the CCP and any funding from China. They can get our funding. They shouldn't have any funding from China because all of it has nefarious consequences or nefarious intentions, all of it. They want to steal our intellectual property. They want to bury themselves into educational institutions. They want to spread misinformation. They want to spread their propaganda. And so, yeah, well, my time on the select committee has shown me some things, and it's also a year out where actually the threat of China is actually becoming more and more eminent or more obvious to us here in the United States. Their intentions are to be the #1 military power in the world by 2049, and they're probably ahead of schedule, and be the world economic, the dominant economic power in the world by 2049. And you know what? I don't want my children or grandchildren to live in a world dominated by the Communist Chinese Party or any Communist Party whatsoever. Thank you, and now I yield my time.
Gentleman yields. It is now in order to consider Amendment Thompson 014 to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by the ranking member on the roster. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 1516, offered by Mr. Thompson.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, over the past decade, the People's Republic of China has poured hundreds of millions of dollars into U.S. universities through Confucius Institutes and other means, and it expects a return on that investment. What is that return on investment? Its influence on students and faculty in the United States, It's having leverage for the Chinese Communist Party to interfere with academic freedom and speech. It's having a backdoor to the Chinese Communist Party to steal intellectual property, information, technology, and research. And this must end. Recognizing that this is a security risk, the 2018 Congress restricted Department of Defense funding to universities that host a Confucius Institute, resulting in the closure of several institutes. Last year, I supported Mr. Pfluger's bill restricting DHS science and technology and research and development funding to the United States universities that host Confucius Institute. I thank Mr. Pfluger for working with Democrats on that bill, and we ultimately reported that bipartisan bill as amended out of the committee. But today, Mr. Pfluger has rejected last year's thoughtful and bipartisan bill and instead returned to basically the same language the committee had to fix last year, but worse. Cracking down on the People's Republic of China and the Chinese Communist Party and protecting U.S. education and innovation is a bipartisan priority. My amendment is straightforward. It replaces Mr. Pfluger's extreme language with the last year's committee-approved bipartisan language. Under Mr. Pfluger's current language, including his prohibition on all DHS funding for any U.S. university that has a relationship with a broadly and vaguely defined Chinese entity of concern, it's likely that many of the universities in every one of our districts would be harmed. For example, in the University of Texas Permian Basin, in Mr. Pfluger's district, has an 8-week summer research experience for students to study in the Shandong University of Science and Technology. Would UT Permian Basin be barred from getting DHS funding, even to help the aftermath of a disaster? Yes, and that just doesn't make sense. The same goes for Tennessee State University in the chairman's district. It partners with a Chinese university that would cause Tennessee State to lose any chance of DHS funding or support, even for emergency preparedness. Hofstra University in Mr. D'Esposito's district has a dual business degree program with Dongbei University of Finance and Economics in China. And Hofstra Law School, where Mr. Garbarino studied, has a student exchange program with East China University of Political Science and Law. I could go on listing how this bill, as it written, could hurt universities and students in each of our districts. But I hope you see what I mean. That's why I'm offering this substitute at this moment. My amendment would make sure that the 10 or so universities that still host Confucius Institute would be restricted from receiving DHS science and technology and research and development funding, which DHS itself has noted would make the most sense because of the bill as written could cut schools in our district off from critical funding that has no relation to partnerships with Chinese universities. My amendment also ensures greater transparency into the relationship between U.S. institutions of higher education and Chinese entities while preserving beneficial cultural and educational exchanges, particularly in historically black colleges and universities and other minority-serving institutions. And it grants the DHS secretary flexibility to, on a case-by-case basis, waive the funding prohibition under certain circumstances, the same flexibility provided to the Secretary of Defense under existing law. I support the spirit of Mr. Pfluger's bill, which seeks to help address the threat posed by the People's Republic of China and the Chinese Communist Party, but I cannot support his proposal to throw away the bipartisan bill we negotiated last Congress. With that, I hope my colleagues will join me in supporting this amendment, Mr. Chairman, and with that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields. Does anyone wish to speak on the amendment to the amendment? If there's no further debate, the question is...
Mr. Chairman, just quickly, I just wanted to add that to the ranking member, Mr. Lilloda also went to Hofstra Law. It was the night program, but he also went to Hofstra Law School.
The gentleman.
I accept the amendment.
The gentleman yields. If there is no further debate, the question is on agreeing to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Ranking Member Thompson. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chairs, the noes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is not agreed to.
Chair, I request a recorded vote.
A recorded vote is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. McCall.
No.
Mr. McCall votes no. Mr. Higgins. No. Mr. Higgins votes no. Mr. Guest. No. Mr. Guest votes no. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop votes no. Mr. Jimenez. Mr. Jimenez votes no. Mr. Pfluger. Mr. Pfluger votes no. Mr. Garbarino. Mr. Garbarino votes no. Ms. Green. Ms. Green votes no. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez votes no. Mr. Lalota. Mr. Lalota votes no. Mr. Ezell. Mr. Ezell votes no. Mr. D'Esposito. Mr. D'Esposito votes no. Ms. Lee. Ms. Lee votes no. Mr. Luttrell. Mr. Luttrell votes no. Mr. Strong. Mr. Strong votes no. Mr. Burkeen. Mr. Crane. Mr. Crane votes no. Mr. Thompson. Mr. Thompson votes aye. Ms. Jackson Lee. Mr. Payne. Mr. Payne votes aye. Mr. Swalwell. Mr. Correa. Mr. Carter. Aye. Mr. Carter votes aye. Mr. Tanadar.
Aye.
Mr. Tanadar votes aye. Mr. Magaziner.
Aye.
Mr. Magaziner votes aye. Mr. Ivy.
Aye.
Mr. Ivy votes aye. Mr. Goldman. Mr. Goldman votes aye. Mr. Garcia. Mr. Garcia votes aye. Mrs. Ramirez. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Menendez votes aye. Ms. Clark. Ms. Clark votes aye. Ms. Titus. Ms. Titus votes aye. Mr. Burkeen. Ms. Jackson Lee. Mr. Swalwell. Mr. Correa. Mrs. Ramirez.
How am I recorded?
Clerk, how am I recorded?
You are not recorded.
Chair votes no.
Chairman Green votes no.
The noes have, oh, I'm sorry. The clerk will tally.
Mr. Chairman, on
Reports
that
tally.
vote, there were 11 yeas, 17 noes.
The noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to. Okay, well, we'll let this slide, Mr. Carrera. You're a no, I assume? Oh, you're a yes, okay. Dang it. All right, tally the count and add Mr. Carrera.
All right, Mr. Correa votes yes.
That was going to be a proxy vote?
Yes.
And the count, the tally, the count.
On that vote, there were 12 yeas, 17 noes.
The noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to. There are no further amendments listed on the roster. Are there any other amendments to the amendment in the nature of substitute? Hearing none, the question is now on agreeing to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. Pfluger. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. Okay. The question now occurs, so the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of the substitute is agreed to. The question now occurs on reporting the bill, H.R. 1516, as amended to the House with favorable recommendation. All those in favor say aye. 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 All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. The ranking member requests a recorded vote. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. McCall.
Aye.
Mr. McCall votes aye. Mr. Higgins. Mr. Higgins votes aye. Mr. Guest. Mr. Guest votes aye. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop votes aye. Mr. Jimenez. Mr. Jimenez votes aye. Mr. Pfluger. Mr. Pfluger votes aye. Mr. Garbarino. Mr. Garbarino votes aye. Ms. Green. Ms. Green votes aye. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez votes aye. Mr. Lalota. Mr. Lalota votes aye. Mr. Ezell. Mr. Ezell votes aye. Mr. D'Esposito. Mr. D'Esposito votes aye. Ms. Lee. Ms. Lee votes aye. Mr. Luttrell. Mr. Strong. Mr. Strong votes aye. Mr. Burkeen. Mr. Crane. Mr. Crane votes aye. Mr. Thompson. Mr. Thompson votes nay. Ms. Jackson Lee. Mr. Payne. Mr. Payne votes no. Mr. Swalwell. Mr. Correa. Mr. Correa votes no. Mr. Carter. Mr. Carter votes no. Mr. Tanadar. Mr. Tanadar votes no. Mr. Magaziner. Mr. Magaziner votes no. Mr. Ivy. Mr. Ivy votes no. Mr. Goldman. Mr. Goldman votes nay. Mr. Garcia. Mr. Garcia votes nay. Mrs. Ramirez. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Menendez votes nay. Ms. Clark. Ms. Clark votes no. Ms. Titus. Ms. Titus votes no. Mr. Luttrell. Mr. Burkeen. Ms. Jackson Lee. Mr. Swalwell. Mrs. Ramirez.
Are there other members in the room who wish to have their vote recorded? How am I recorded?
You are not recorded.
The chair votes aye.
Chairman Green votes aye.
Clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 16 yeas, 12 noes.
The ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to without objection. The motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 6174, the DHS Biodetection Improvement Act. The bill was circulated in advance and printed copies available. The clerk shall designate the bill.
H.R. 6174.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and it's considered read and open to amendment at any time. The gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Strong, is recognized for 5 minutes on his measure.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm pleased that the committee is convened today to mark up this important piece of legislation. In response to the 2001 anthrax attacks, the Department of Homeland Security established a BioWatch program, which is a monitoring system that collects and tests the air samples for biological agents likely to be used in a bioterrorism attack. Currently operated by the Countering Weapons of Mass Destruction Office, the technology behind the BioWatch program was originally developed in coordination with the Department of Energy's national laboratories. However, since 2019, DHS has faced continuous challenges in acquiring biodetection capabilities to replace BioWatch. And while DHS has the authority to utilize the Department of Energy's national labs to identify and develop new technologies related to biodefense, to date, DHS has underutilized that resource. For that reason, I'm introducing H.R. 6174, the DHS Biodetection Improvement Act. This legislation directs the Secretary of Homeland Security to conduct an assessment of how DHS has utilized the Department of Energy's national labs and sites and submit a strategy for how the department will coordinate with the DOE to address biodetection research and development. Specifically, the strategy requires DHS to identify and develop an acquisition and procurement plan to acquire existing biodetection technologies that can either individually or together meet the department's biodetection mission needs. Conduct periodic external evaluations to identify gaps and potential failure points with respect to such biodetection technologies, and develop a clearly defined program and technical requirements for future DHS biodetection programs. Furthermore, to ensure that DHS is held accountable, H.R. 6174 requires DHS to report to the House Committee on Homeland Security and the Senate Committee on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs regarding the assessment and strategies no later than 1 year after the date of enactment. Over the years, the threats from America's enemies have continually evolved and become more complex. Given this, I believe that this is critical that the federal government increases interagency coordination to improve America's bioweapons defense posture. I want to thank Chairman Green and all members who have shown their support by signing on to this as original co-sponsors of this legislation. I urge all members to join me in supporting this critically important piece of legislation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
Does anyone wish to speak on the bill? Are there any amendments to the bill? Hearing none, the question is on reporting the bill favorably to the House. All those in favor signify by saying aye. All opposed say no. In the opinion of the chairs, the ayes has it, and the motion is agreed to. Without objection, the motion to consider is laid upon the table. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 5969, the Improving Travel for Families Act. The bill was circulated in advance and printed copies are available. The clerk shall designate the bill.
H.R. 5969.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with and is considered read and open to amendments at any point. I now recognize Mr. Luttrell for the purpose of offering an amendment in the nature of a substitute. The clerk will report the amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5969, offered by Mr. Luttrell.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered base text for the purpose of further amendments. The gentleman from Texas is recognized for 5 minutes on his amendment. I recognize Mr. Ivey.
I'm a co-sponsor of the bill, and we had worked on this bill together. And so since he's not present, I could just to facilitate things.
Yes, sir, please, if you would mind. I recognize Mr. Ivey for the purpose of speaking on the amendment that's a substitute to the original legislation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to be careful about speaking on behalf of the actual sponsor of the legislation, but I decided to co-sponsor this bill because I thought it made a lot of sense. The idea here is just to facilitate in travel scenarios for under the Global Entry Program, just to make it more family friendly. So it does this by allowing children ages 10 or under to accompany their parent or legal guardian through the Global Entry when clearing customs in the United States. The bill also makes it possible for parents to schedule interviews for Global Entry for their kids as a group. I think, up to 4 is the number that it would go up to. As Mr. Luttrell, I believe, would say, we've already heard how difficult it is to schedule just one of these appointments. Now imagine being a parent trying to make separate appointments for each of their kids. This appealed to me. I have 6 kids. They're all grown now. But when we were traveling all together, it was a bit of a logistical nightmare. This helps to facilitate that and make it easier. And I'll make one serious point, too. One of the issues that there was concern about was whether this could be used or abused with respect to trafficking children. We did outreach to advocacy groups to make sure that they didn't have any concerns on that front. In fact, we were told by the government agencies and by the advocacy groups that this bill would actually make it harder because of the multiple checks to be in the Global Entry Program. So if somebody's trying to abuse, or kidnap kids or something along those lines, usually in a family context, they wouldn't be able to do it as easily through the Global Entry Program. They would just go circumvent it. So for those reasons, I support Mr. Luttrell's bill, and I encourage all of my colleagues to do the same.
Do any other members wish to speak on the amendment? The chair recognizes Mr. Payne.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I support this bill and the amendment in the substitute offered here today. The Global Entry Service allows pre-approved, low-risk travelers to receive expedited clearance upon arrival in the United States through automatic kiosks at select airports such as Newark Liberty International Airport in my district. Thanks to this legislation, parents enrolled in Global Entry with traveling children aged 10 or younger would be able to bring their children through the Global Entry line upon arrival from the international flight. I cannot think of anything more low risk than children traveling with their parents, with their pre-approved parents. While a policy such as this is warranted, we can do better when setting policies that improve the interactions the DHS personnel have with children. This belief is one of many reasons I introduced the Homeland Security for Children Act, which was signed into law last year. One specific area where I believe we can improve a proposal such as this is to extend this policy to cover all minors who may have special needs, such as a physical or developmental disability, traveling with their parents. I'm aware that Customs and Border Protection plans to publish a Federal Register notice soon regarding the policy change proposed by the underlying bill. I plan to reach out to CBP and encourage them to expand this change so that all children aged 10 and under, along with any minor with a disability, can access global entry lane with their enrolled parents. I hope my colleagues in the majority are willing to work with me on this and see the benefit, not just for the 12-year-old child on the spectrum who just got off a flight with their parents from abroad, but also for parents who would no longer have to deal with long CBP lines only because their child with special needs is not enrolled in global entry. And Mr. Chairman, with that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Luttrell for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ranking Member Thompson for bringing up this important bill before the committee today. I'm pleased with my colleague, Mr. Ivey, to introduce H.R. 5969, the Improving Travel for Families Act. Global entry has been a critical asset in expediting clearances for pre-approved low-risk travelers who do not have any criminal records and who exhibit good merit upon the arrival to the United States. Reduced wait times and access to expedite entry into the United States are benefits of global entry membership. Unfortunately, the global entry program currently has an application and interview backlog with applications processing times for over 4 to 6 months. Under current law, only pre-approved global entry travelers are permitted to utilize dedicated lanes and kiosks. This can create a major inconvenience for global entry approved parents with young children who are not global entry approved. My office has heard firsthand details from travelers and airport staff who have global entry memberships and traveling with their infants who do not have memberships have been told they cannot utilize global entry lanes. This measure, introduced with my friend, again, Congressman Ivey, from Maryland, simply permits a child who is 10 years of age or under, who is not a member of Global Entry, and who is traveling with a parent or legal guardian who is a member of Global Entry, can accompany them through the Global Entry lane upon arrival at an international airport in the United States. Additionally, it also permits a parent or legal guardian who is applying on behalf of their children for Global Entry membership to schedule a single interview appointment for up to 4 children. As the holiday season approaches and we move into the future, such legislation is needed to provide more flexibility for families traveling with children internationally and for appointments to be consolidated for those seeking global entry for their children. Thank you again, Mr. Green, Mr. Ivey, and the ranking member for bringing this important bill before the committee. And thank you, Congressman Payne, for raising awareness on this issue. It is imperative that the children with disabilities have the ability to accompany their parents or legal guardians through global entry lanes. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields, and I now recognize Mr. Correa for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to thank Mr. Luttrell for your legislation. Any of you who have ever applied for a global entry, you know it's a very exhaustive background check. And you got family, kids, it's a brutal process. And this is good for travelers coming back to the U.S., adds to our security, but you also want to make it convenient for families. So, Mr. Luttrell, thank you very much for your legislation. Look forward to supporting it.
Gentleman yields. Do I have anyone else who wants to make a comment or speak on the amendment? Okay. There are no further amendments listed on the roster. Are there any other amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Hearing none, the question now is agreeing to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. Luttrell. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. We'll do that again. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, nay.
The ayes have it in the opinion of the chair, and the amendment and the nature of the substitute is agreed to. The question now occurs.
That felt like voter intimidation to me, but
The question now occurs on reporting the bill H.R. 5969 as amended to the House for the favorable recommendation. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 4403, the Securing the Cities Improvement Act. The bill was circulated in advance and printed copies are available. The clerk shall designate the bill.
H.R. 4403.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with and it is considered read and open to amendment at any time. I now recognize the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Carter. He's recognized for 5 minutes on the measure.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. I'm pleased to present this bipartisan legislation which would help cities build and maintain their security capabilities against nuclear and radiological threats. First, I'd like to stress, while my bill is a priority and of the utmost importance, it can only help cities if the DHS Office of Counter Weapons and Mass Destruction is authorized before December 21st, 2023 sunset. Without CWMD, there's a real possibility that the securing of cities programs would cease to operate. In May, our committee passed legislation to address the December 21st sunset. I look forward to continuing the work with my colleagues to address sunset issues so that programs like Securing the Cities will continue to be fully operational. The Securing the Cities initiative, also called STC, was launched by the Department of Homeland Security in fiscal year 2007 as a pilot program to support New York City, New Jersey, and Newark in detecting and preventing nuclear or radiological threats. The STC program has now grown and provides 14 local governments with detection equipment, training exercise support, operational and technical subject matter expertise, and programmatic support. However, the program is limited to high-risk urban areas designated by the Federal Emergency Management Agency under Urban Area Security Initiative, UASI program. This linkage between STC and UASI can create uncertainty for local governments participating in the program, as the composition of jurisdictions in the UASI program can vary considerably from one year to the next. To ensure stability within STC program and partnerships with at-risk cities, I introduced the Securing the Cities Improvement Act. This legislation would allow CWMD to determine which cities to partner with in the STC program based on the jurisdiction's capability and capacity to prepare for and respond to threats or vulnerabilities against a terrorist attack and other high-consequence events utilizing nuclear and/or other radiological materials. It would also establish performance metrics and milestones for STC program and monitor expenditures for the program. Furthermore, this legislation will require DHS to provide a report to Congress regarding participation in the STC program, the establishment of matrix and milestones for the program, and plans for any changes. Finally, Mr. Chairman, I would like to personally thank my colleague from the great state of Louisiana, Mr. Higgins, and the ranking member, Mr. Thompson, for partnering with me on this important piece of legislation. With that, I ask your full support, ask my colleagues to support this bill and advance it. I yield back the balance of my time.
Does anyone, or the gentleman yields, does anyone wish to speak on the amendment, or on the bill, I'm sorry? I'll just say that I, as the chair, I fully support this bill. I think it's wisdom, and I think we all need to support it. So with that, I yield, and does anyone else want to be recognized? Hearing none, are there any amendments to the bill? Hearing none, the question is on reporting the bill favorably to the House. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion to report favorably is agreed to. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 6231, the Department of Homeland Security Policy Issuance Review Act. The bill was circulated in advance. The printed copies are available. The clerk shall designate the bill.
H.R. 6231.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and it is considered read and open to amendment at any time. I now recognize the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Ivey, for 5 minutes on his measure.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I promise not to use the whole 5 minutes. I did want to, though, say that I'm pleased to offer this legislation, and I appreciate it being considered today. This bipartisan bill will ensure that Congress has greater insight into DHS's process for issuing and reviewing department-wide policies. These policy documents provide critical guidance to over 260,000 men and women who carry out the DHS mission every day. And these go to critical missions that involve sensitive identification data, the counterintelligence program, the integrated maritime law enforcement program, and the like. These policies should provide much-needed guidance and clarity on what is expected of DHS employees. However, despite a requirement that each policy receive a thorough review every 2 years, many foundational policies have gone far longer without a meaningful review or needed updates. When it comes to topics that evolve rapidly, like social media, biometric technologies, or artificial intelligence, it's important that the policy documents keep up with these changing times. My bill will codify the department's policy issuance and review process as a formal responsibility of the DHS Undersecretary for Management. Additionally, it will provide more transparency for Congress by requiring the department to provide an annual briefing to the committee on these policies that are issued, reviewed, and canceled each year. The department will also be required to provide detailed information on how policies are prioritized for review and how DHS headquarters collaborates with component departments to ensure that any agency affected has the opportunity to comment. Finally, to make sure that the management directorate is properly resourced to carry out this review process, my bill also requires that the briefing include information on any staffing vacancies. I'd like to take a moment to thank Representatives Clark, Bishop, and Ezell for co-sponsoring this legislation. I appreciate their support on this. And with that, I urge all members of the committee to support the legislation. I ask for your support, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Does anyone wish to speak on the bill? I'll recognize myself for just a few seconds. I think this is a timely bill. You know, I think both parties would agree that we, as the Congress, have granted a lot of power to the bureaucracy, the administration, being able to oversight effectively requires that policies get reviewed, and in that review process, we can look at it and just see the power that has been sort of granted in rulemaking and all that stuff. I really think this is a very good bill, and I'm glad and honored and pleased to support it. Does anyone else wish to speak on the bill? Okay, hearing none. Are there any amendments to the bill? Hearing none, the question is on reporting the bill favorably to the House. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion to report favorably is agreed to. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Without objection, staff is authorized to make any required technical or conforming changes to reflect the actions of the committee today. I want to thank all the members for being here. It's been, I think, the debate this morning on the first measure was, I thought, fantastic, and everyone had genuine motives, and it was a great discussion, despite some disagreement. I want to let everybody in the committee know that we will have a floor date coming up for the bipartisan bills that we've passed. I have petitioned the leader for that to happen sooner rather than later, and I should have a date hopefully within a week, and we'll get that out through the ranking member and through our staff side as well. This concludes the consideration of the bills noticed by the committee for today.
Mr. Chairman.
You're recognized.
Mr. Chairman, pursuant to Clause 2L of Rule 11, I request that members have 2 calendar days to file with the clerk of the committee supplemental, additional, or minority views on the measures ordered reported by the committee today.
So ordered. There being no further business, and without objection, the committee stands adjourned.